Hi, I am Mark Silver. I'm a photographer and educator, and I want to talk to you about achieving your creative goals as a photographer without struggling with gear. And we could subtitle that, There is More to Photography Than Cameras. And one of the things I like to do is debunk myths, and there are a bunch in the gear department, so let's talk about them. These are what they say. When I track down they, I'm going to have a serious talk with them. But you got to watch these things where everybody kind of knows this is the way it is, because a lot of times those things are not true. Point number one, new cameras are better. Better than what? Are they better than you knowing your gear and trusting it and having it be like an extension to your hand and being instinctive? Or is it better to have to go through a whole new learning curve with every new camera and learn its menus and how to set it up and customize it? No, because that's taking you away from the art of photography. It isn't, unless you want it to be. If you enjoy fiddling with gear, then be my guest. I don't. I want to go out and capture beautiful photographs. Or whatever, impactful photographs. And to me, the most important thing is to know my equipment. Now, when I was a new photographer, I used a camera, not this camera. This is a Hasselblad. I got this later on, but I used a camera that essentially had 3 controls in it, which is focus, that's what this has, aperture, and shutter, and that's it. So once you know where those controls are, your hand just goes there. It should just go there like an instinctive thing. You don't have to think, let's see, which one of these knobs? You want it to be like that, because your attention should be on capturing your subject out there, not what's going on here. We call this being extroverted, attention out in the environment. This is being introverted, looking inwards. And the worst place for your attention to be is right smack in the middle of your head. That's really introverted. We don't want that. And that's actually another subject we'll get into sometime. But these are still the 3 most important controls in any camera, no matter how many menus. Now, up to 20 years ago, that was it. Those 3 controls, about 2003-ish. Digital photography started taking form in a realistic way, so people started taking it seriously. That's about when I jumped into it. Up until that time, you had your cameras with 3 controls. Now, all of a sudden, the camera manufacturer's gotten this idea, the more stuff it can do, the better. I don't know that I agree with that. It's kind of like the more things that go on in that camera, the more chances for error also and distraction. Remember, it's about capturing that moment, seeing the photograph, and grabbing it. So let's not get hung up in the new gear thing, okay? And get a lot of lenses. Why? I hear about, you should only shoot with prime lenses. Like you gotta just be a purist. There's some sort of like high and mighty ethical code of I am so pure that I switch lenses all the time. It's a bunch of BS for many reasons. One, every pro I know does not shoot with prime lenses. They generally shoot with this lens right here, which is a 24-70. I use this for 98% of my photography, and it allows me a good focal length range without having to fiddle. We want to eliminate the fiddle time. Now, the other danger in switching lenses, every time you open your digital camera, or any camera for that matter, you're exposing it to dirt and dust and junk that can get on your sensor. And that's a real bummer to get back, get a beautiful image, and you've got to do a whole bunch of lens sensor spotting. It's just, that's not the fun of photography. The fun of photography is capturing an image and going back and processing it, not fiddling with spotting, okay? So there's many reasons to get to know. Again, it's like getting to know your camera, get to know your lens. If you have caught up in this, oh, I got to be a prime lens person, throw that aside. Get your preferred lens. Maybe it's a 35 millimeter lens and you go around and shoot with that all the time. I did that for years. Dan Milner says shoot with a 50. Okay, cool. Go with it. Use your feet to zoom. I always advocate that. That's, Robert Capra said, if your photographs are not good enough, you're not close enough. Get close. Use your feet. Zoom with your feet. Okay. Let's cross this out. Okay, you should experiment all the time. I don't know about that. There is a time to experiment. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But don't experiment with gear and equipment. You want that to hold a stable point in your life, in your photography. You don't want to switch it around all the time. What if you went into your kitchen, that drawer where as weird as it may be organized, but where everything is in it, and somebody comes along and does a good deed and organizes it and decides, well, half of those things should really be in the garage and none of those things that were there really belong there, so they took them out. And you open that drawer and you're like, where's that? My favorite knife, my favorite carving knife, my favorite spatula, it's no longer there. That's really confusing and upsetting. And so that's why you don't want to experiment all the time. You want to get to know that setup and use it. Now, where do you want to experiment? You should experiment with your composition. You should get to know different angles. What is it like to shoot, with your camera way up high like this or really low? I mean, what's great about having your screen tilt, you can do that. You can pull out your screen and you can hold the camera way up high like this or really down low, and that's awesome. You should experiment with those different angles or even turning your camera on an angle like this, right? If you've read my books, you know that I talk about that. That's what you should experiment with, not with your gear and your equipment. And I do think that's really important advice because too many people walk around and just photograph at eye level. There's so many different ways. And I wrote a book about composition. There's 83 different compositional tools. Most photographers know about 4 or 5. Well, what if your vocabulary consists of 4 or 5 words like mine does in some languages? Arigato, Ohio. I mean, I know about 3 or 4 words. My communication doesn't go very far, okay? But you want your photography to be very fluent and have many different options. Okay, shoot in manual. Oh my God. Shoot in manual? Oh, come on. Where did this fall out of the heavens? I am such a great photographer because I only shoot in manual. Again, the pros I know, You know what they shoot in? Some of them shoot in P and use their exposure compensation. Some of them shoot in P and use exposure compensation. I know a really great photographer who does that. I don't. I shoot in aperture priority, as I believe most pros do. Why? Because I've already predetermined what I want that shutter speed to be. If I'm trying to stop the action, obviously I have a very, very fast shutter speed. If I want to drag the shutter and have show some motion, I'm going to slow it down. Okay, that I've gotten that out of the equation. Now what I'm really concerned with is what am I going to do with that aperture? That's why I set it at aperture priority. It's one less knob to fiddle with. Listen, the less fiddling you do, the more you're going to be doing the art of photography. Unless you like fiddling. If that's your game, okay, by all means, fiddle away. But I don't believe that's really what photography is all about. So let's cross this out. All right, we've gotten rid of 4 big things. Now let's look at what we really want to focus on is set a simple standard in your gear and in your photography. And that also applies to processing. Different subject, but same idea. Get a standard and get to know it really well. and use it again until it's instinctive. Okay? And that could change with the different genres of photography, your standard for shooting a landscape, which might even be on a tripod, could be very different than when you're shooting sports. But you still know this is my standard for that type of photography. Get to know it. And as Bob Holmes says, our friend Bob Holmes, you've got to get to know what your camera sees, which is different, very different than what your eye sees. As I'm sitting here, first of all, I can see stuff way out of the frame over here. My camera will not see that. But also my eyes are adjusting constantly to the light changes. Your camera does not have that same latitude. So you have to know what your camera sees. And the very best way to learn that is to go outside, or you could do this indoors, but I prefer to go outside. And let's say I'm going to just take something like a tree, photograph it. I want to take a good note of what I see with my eye, what I see through the viewfinder. Do that little comparison. Take a few shots, take the card out, bring it in, look at it on your computer. Make sure you have your monitor correctly calibrated, because again, we want to hold a standard. Now see what your camera saw and do a mental comparison. What was I looking at a moment ago? How did that look? Wow, I thought that was really bright. And it turns out it wasn't, or I didn't know that was so blown out. Now it is blown out. Okay, so notice those things. Those are going to teach you what your camera sees. We have to learn the language of this camera. It interprets light differently, every camera. And in the film days, every film interpreted light differently. So you'd have to not only know your camera, but what film you're using. If you're using Kodachrome, for instance, very different than using a black and white like Panatomic X. Very different way it interprets light. And that you need to know. And that comes from that kind of practice. And by the way, this is a key point with your equipment. John Todd, a great sports photographer, said, go out in your backyard and just practice rapidly, pulling your camera out, focusing and firing. Just because in sports in particular, you have very fast action, but this is true with almost every form of photography. It doesn't matter, wedding photography. That little girl who was doing a little spin right at that moment, with a flower right then, you fiddle, you miss that brilliant shot. So this is the moral of this story, you guys. Don't get hung up in gear. Focus on the art of photography, and you learn it through practice, and more practice. And by being educated by people who have something important to say, and I hope you believe that I do. And if you do, please give me a like, and I love to hear your comments, even if you have a rant and you're like, Mark, I think you're just full of you-know-what. I love prime lenses, and I'll never give them up, and it's one of my greatest joys to open up a big case and have 12 lenses. Okay, tell me about it. I want to hear. I get it. So leave your comments. And, the most important thing, and I would love it if you shared. And by the way, please follow me on Instagram, because I'm making reels and I'm starting a whole new series right now. So that's going to keep us kind of connected in between. All righty. Thank you, guys. And don't get hung up in your gear. Get a standard, practice, and remember, it's all about the art of photography at the end of the day, and what enables you to be the photographer who captures images that you love. And one last thing, I want to remind you, get out and capture your own images of life. Love you guys. Stay safe, stay creative, and I'll see you again soon.